Good morning and welcome to the sixth and final topic in this economics course. This morning we're going to look at the role of government. We're going to introduce government into the circular flow, and we're going to look at the role of government within the context of stabilization policy. As usual, we have a listing of the key issues in the hyperlinks, and we also have a listing of the readings, which excludes the readings from Parkin, so these are additional readings. And we're now in a position to introduce government. And what government does, as you can see, and we're introducing government on the left, government takes money away from people in the form of taxes. It takes money away from firms in the form of taxes, and it spends that money back into the government as government expenditure to households, which in most countries is predominantly expenditure on public servants, teachers, nurses, police, etc. In parts of the rich world, it can also include various kinds of social safety nets, so disability pensions, ordinary pensions, old age pensions, and things of that nature. And government also spends money to firms to buy the kinds of things that firms are making, so computers, paper, pens, red tape, and things of that nature. At this point, we now have the final component of the circular flow. We have the final component of the economy in the structure, and we finally have the overall structure of the economy. And you'll see that what we have is we've got four markets. Without repeating them, they're the four markets that we've introduced, and those markets are all by and large self-regulating. In government, there's no market for government in that sense of the word. Rather, from government we get policy. And as you can see in this box that we have here, we have two types of policy. We have so-called long-term economic policy and short-term stabilization policy. Long-term economic policy is about the rule of law, ensuring social equity, ensuring that we don't have pollution and things of that nature. And it's not really what this course has been focused on, because those are things that change slowly, and those are things that you as a business person are able to get on top of with a reasonable amount of speed, because they change slowly. The focus of this course has been on short-term stabilization policy, and that's the discussion in topic 6. It's about stabilization policy, and it's about stabilization policy in the context of government. We have discussed stabilization policy in various forms across this course, and we started off in topic 1 where we talk about the business cycle, and the kind of stabilization we're talking about when we talk about short-term stabilization policy is government actions in order to stabilize the business cycle. So to repeat, when we talk about stabilization policy, these are actions that government takes in order to stabilize the business cycle. That's what we're talking about when we talk about stabilization policy. We've already discussed stabilization policy in the context of financial markets. So in financial markets, we've spoken extensively about stabilization policy. And in this particular case, your policy option, the very first policy option that you would choose from financial markets and from the central bank is, of course, interest rates. The second area of stabilization policy is balance of payments policy and the stabilization of the exchange rate. And from a policy point of view, your first policy option in terms of how you would attempt to stabilize exchange rates would be interest rates. So again, we're using interest rates as the first policy option. So if a currency is losing value, you would, for example, increase interest rates. If you want to prevent an appreciation of the currency, you may choose to decrease interest rates and so on. Interest rates as your first policy choice. Your second policy choice would be changes in reserves. So you may choose to use the reserves account to either increase or decrease the value of the currency. Those are the modern weapons of choice, the modern policy options. But you may also want to go for more drastic actions. So for instance, you may want to go for import duties, import controls, exchange rate controls, various things of that nature. That they aren't used very often in the rich world. They are used to a lesser extent in emerging markets. And then we now introduce the next component of stabilization policy, which is stabilization inside of government. And for the first time, we introduced what is called fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is all about what government does in terms of the government budget in order to stabilize the business cycle. In essence, fiscal stabilization is all about using the government budget, and the government budget is government expenditure and taxes. The combination of those two flows is the government budget. So in the context of government and fiscal policy, it's all about using government expenditure and taxes in order to stabilize the business cycle. We are going to see in a moment that there have been various chronological, in other words, historical changes in the way that fiscal policy has been conducted. In certain periods, there was no fiscal policy. In other periods, fiscal policy focused exclusively on the use of expenditure and taxes. And in other periods, more recent times, fiscal policy has in fact focused on the budget deficit. Before we begin that discussion on stabilization policy within the context of government, it's just useful to introduce and just firm up on certain amounts of terminology. So this is really, in many cases, a repeat of what we said a moment ago. So from a terminological perspective, government taxes households, it spends back into the economy, either as security, social security on public servants. When expenditure exceeds taxes, we have a budget deficit. That's what it's called. And then the way that you finance the budget deficit is you can finance the budget deficit either by borrowing domestically, which means borrowing inside your country, or you can borrow offshore. If you borrow domestically, the place that you're borrowing from is from the capital market or the long bond market, and this would be the primary long bond market, or you can also borrow from the money market. That option is open to you. Where we look at government policy, to repeat what was said a moment ago, you get long-term economic policy, education, health, etc., and you get short-term stabilization policy, where what we're doing in stabilization policy is to stabilize the economy in the face of shocks, business cycle stabilization. These are the three areas of stabilization policy: monetary policy, and your policy instruments, as I said a moment ago, interest rates is your first policy instrument. You may go for reserve requirement changes. It's a very blunt instrument. And in more recent times, we've had quantitative easing and at the moment, talk of tapering, meaning reduction of QE. From a balance of payments perspective, your policy instruments are interest rates, again, to repeat what we said a moment ago, the reserves account, and import barriers of various kinds. And then finally, fiscal policy, we have changes in government expenditure. The simplest way of discussing fiscal policy is to do it chronologically. So to actually give a brief history of fiscal policy. It's the easiest way to understand how fiscal policy has come into fashion and how the nature of fiscal policy has changed over time. So in terms of understanding the chronological history of fiscal policy, the best way to start is before the Great Depression. We then have a look at what happens post the Great Depression until late 1970s, early 1980s. We then look at 1970s to the beginning of the financial crisis, what happened over the course of the financial crisis 2007, or the beginnings of the financial crisis 2007, 2009, and then what happened from 2010 until the current time. So if we start with the pre-Great Depression, the approach of economists at the time was what's so-called classical theories of the world, and under the classical theories of the world, economists viewed the economy as largely self-regulating. So as demand and supply changed, so prices would change. The conclusion you draw from that is that all markets clear, including the labor market, and the conclusion that you draw from that is that long-term unemployment was not possible. The policy conclusions that come out of that approach is, of course, that there's no point in intervening in the economy because it's self-defeating. The economy is going to self-regulate, so there's no point in doing as government in intervening because your unemployment is temporary, and it's going to sort itself out. Clearly, with the onset of the Great Depression, there was serious doubts cast on the classical approach. So following from the Great Depression, we have the doubts about the classical approach and the beginnings of interventionist government policy. And it starts with a man called John Maynard Keynes. So we talk about Keynesian economic policy, that is John Maynard Keynes. And what Keynes begins to advocate is so-called interventionist policy. And to put it quite simply, he advocated that the classical economists merely look around them in the context of the Great Depression. They would see that there's sustained and significant unemployment, and that there clearly is something wrong with the classical laissez-faire approach to the world, and that intervention is necessary. What Keynes also advocated, and this was lost somewhere in the policy interventions, is that this kind of activist government intervention should only occur in periods of sustained economic turbulence. So the Great Depression, for instance, the financial crisis, for instance, those are the appropriate times where you should be using these interventionist policies. They shouldn't be used for small things. So in that case, where there are small changes, Keynes would have sided with the classical economists and would have said that in the cases of small recessions, little bits of inflation, the market is self-regulating and government really shouldn't get involved in that. This policy advocation, the way that Keynes was going with fiscal policy and the use of fiscal policy, was reinforced by the fact that at the time monetary policy was largely impotent. And the reason for that, if you recall, is that in the period we're looking at, the 1940s to the 1970s, central banks could not control interest rates. They controlled money supply by various other kinds of monetary policy instruments, for example, like reserve requirements. And these were very blunt instruments. So monetary policy could not really be used as a stabilization policy. It's only since the post-1980s, when the central banks took control of interest rates, that monetary policy really was used as intervention and stabilization policy. The consequence was that fiscal policy really was the only game in town. You can't use monetary policy to a large extent for stabilization. And in fact, the period, the 1940s to the 1970s, is a period, it's the Bretton Woods period of exchange rates, meaning exchange rates were fixed. So you didn't have destabilization from an exchange rate perspective. You couldn't use monetary policy, therefore you could only use fiscal policy. The type of fiscal policy that Keynes advocated is so-called discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary, where government makes discrete or policy-based changes to taxes and or government expenditure. So, for example, if government wanted to stimulate the economy, it would make a discrete policy change to expenditure. So it would increase expenditure, it would build roads, it would give salary increases to teachers, particularly, and I think most importantly, it would give salary increases to university professors. That was the most important way to increase expenditure. Or it would decrease taxes. Decrease in taxes, you have more money in your pocket, of course, you would spend more. So those two policy options would result in stimulatory policy. Government could go for contractionary fiscal policy, so it could cut expenditure and it could increase taxes. One of the problems that began to emerge with the use of Keynesian discretionary fiscal policy, and this was no fault of Keynes, is that what governments began to do was began to use fiscal policy for what became called fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is where governments started to use fiscal policy not when there were major problems in the economy, but rather when there were minor problems in the economy. So, for instance, if government has a target, say, of economic growth of 5% and the economy is growing at 4%, governments then began to use discretionary fiscal policy to ensure that the economy grew at the 5% rather than the 4% level. That was problematic. In addition to that, and to repeat what I said a moment ago, is that monetary policy was was also largely ineffective between the 1940s and the 1970s. And I'm not going to repeat what was said. That was done in the previous slide. So two types of problems begin to emerge with the use of discretionary fiscal policy. The first one is the size of the budget deficit. If you run an ongoing stimulatory policy, if your expenditure is consistently bigger than government expenditure, your budget deficit will increase, and it can result in policy impotence if it becomes too large. And for that, you need to go back to topic number 1 and see the discussion about Japan and the policy impotence as a result of what happened in Japan as a result of that very, very large budget deficit and the very large public debt. The second problem that emerges from discretionary fiscal policy is how you pay for the budget deficit. And this too can have unintended consequences. So if you want to pay for the budget deficit, and this is repeating from what we saw in an earlier slide, but I think with a little bit more detail. If you want to finance the budget deficit, in other words, you want to get the money to pay for the difference between expenditure and taxes, you can do it in one of three ways. You can borrow from the capital market, you can borrow from the money market, or you can borrow from international markets, meaning you can borrow offshore. There are potentially certain unintended consequences from doing that. So if you borrow from the capital market, obviously you're borrowing from local markets. But the unintended consequences are that it could result in higher interest rates in the capital market. Government is borrowing more in the capital market. It means that demand for funds is higher in the capital market, and if there's a higher demand for funds in the capital market, the price in the capital market can go up for those funds, meaning that there's higher capital market interest rates. That has the potential to do what is called in economics crowding out private investment. In other words, the increased borrowing from government results in higher interest rates in the capital market, which makes private sector borrowing too expensive, and private sector is therefore reduced. To talk the talk of economics, private sector is crowded out. If governments borrow in the money market, they're borrowing from the banking sector. In today's world, the banking sector would approach the central bank for the funding. So effectively, government is in fact borrowing money from the central bank via the banking sector. And under certain circumstances, the unintended consequence of that is that the increase in money supply may result in inflation. It doesn't always happen, and it wouldn't necessarily happen in a recession, but where governments are fine-tuning and you have growth rates of 4% rather than 5%, that is a situation where the economy is fairly close to full employment. If government borrows from the money market under those circumstances and there's increases in money supply, that is going to result in an increase in inflation. The final source of funding is to borrow offshore. So you borrow into international markets, and the unintended consequences of that is you can get a currency appreciation. I'm borrowing offshore, and I'm bringing foreign exchange back into the country. So in the foreign exchange market, the curve that moves is an increase in supply of foreign exchange. Government is taking bonds offshore, but it's bringing foreign exchange back. So there's an increase in supply of foreign exchange. The supply curve shifts to the right, the currency can appreciate. If the currency appreciates, and under certain special conditions, it has the potential to undermine the competitiveness of locally produced goods, particularly for the export market. The second of the unintended consequences is that if you do borrow offshore, clearly you need to pay back the loans. And there's significant foreign exchange risk in that kind of thing. So if you borrowed, for example, if one borrows dollars offshore, and a good example of this actually is Brazil, in starting about 2012, where Brazil was borrowing offshore in dollars, and then in about 2015, 2014, the real depreciated, and the consequence was that in real terms, there was a significant increase in the cost of the debt to Brazil. That can have major unintended consequences and major macroeconomic consequences. The second category of problems that emerge as a result of discretionary fiscal policy and the fine-tuning component of discretionary fiscal policy are the so-called lags. And the lags that we have, there are three kinds of lags. There's the so-called recognition lag, the administration lag, and the implementation lag. If we go back to recognition, the recognition lag is the time it takes between economic changes occurring and the recognition that economic changes have occurred. And the problem clearly in that is a data collection problem. So for example, you may have problems occurring in June in the real world, but the data only starts coming through maybe in September, October, November. So there can be quite easily at least a 3-month lag, if not a 6-month lag, between changes happening in the economy and the recognition that changes are happening in the economy. Once that's done, then the second lag that we have, called the administration lag, is a lag about what to do. So what can you do about it? And that requires administrative decisions. So you may, for instance, want to hire more teachers. You may want to, and most importantly, increase the salary of university lecturers, and I'll stop saying that now. And the two areas where you can change your expenditure is on the expenditure side. If you're going to do that, you need to have potential projects in line. It takes a very long time to create new projects. So if I want to build a road, if I want to build a bridge, the planning process in itself is a significant period of time. So you need to have projects on the shelf to take off, and that's very difficult because projects on the shelf go stale, so that they simply are not appropriate for the time that you want to use it. The second alternative that you have is to change taxes. But that's a real problem, because if you think about it, if you look at it from a corporate perspective, you can increase taxes on companies this year, you can increase taxes on company next year, you can make it 20%, you can make it 30%, then you can make it 40%. Then the economy starts to slow down, so you want to stimulate the economy, so now you make taxes 20%, you make it 10%, you make it 5%, and then sometime in the future you again begin to increase. There's a clear problem with this, and that is that companies cannot plan. You can't do that. And then finally, you have what are called the implementation lags. And the implementation lags is the time between the implementation of a policy and the actual money hitting the economy. Let's take, for example, the building of a road. If you build a road and you start building a road in June, a road is going to take 5 years to build, particularly if it's a highway and if it's a significant project. So we may have problems emerging in June, and we start building the road in June, but in 1 year's time, the economy is well through those problems, or even in 2 years' time, the economy is well through those problems. Yet the stimulation from the road is still continuing and continuing for 5 years. So the combination of these three problems, the recognition, administration, implementation lag, typically meant that where governments were fine-tuning, by the time the time period between a problem starting in the economy and the policy impact of the fine-tuning often meant that the initial problem to the economy had simply gone away, and the government actions became pro-cyclical rather than contra-cyclical. In other words, government actions were no longer stabilizing, they were destabilizing. So government would go, for instance, for stimulatory policies because there was a recession. By the time the policy and the impact of the policy hit the economy, the recession was well over, the economy was in a growth phase, and the stimulatory package hits the economy in the growth phase, and of course it makes the growth phase bigger and it causes inflation. Similarly, if there was a contractionary drive on fiscal policy because of inflation, because of very high levels of growth, often the contractionary impacts of the policy would hit the economy long after the boom of the economy was over, long after the recessionary problems had been solved, and the contractionary effects of government policy hit the economy as the economy is going into recession and make the recession worse. So these lags, coupled with the attempt to fine-tune, resulted in pro-cyclical government policies rather than contra-cyclical. The consequence was that from the 1970s then, when these problems began to emerge and were noticed, is that discretionary fiscal policy falls into dispute. It's no longer used. Simultaneously with that, central banks then take control of interest rates, and they're able to use monetary policy and interest rates as a very subtle way of changing the economy and of very rapid changes in the economy. If issues emerge in June with the economy, we can recognize those problems by October, November. We can see the problems are occurring. We can change interest rates within a week. And the policy impacts of those interest rate changes start working their way through the economy immediately, rather than with all the lags that we saw with fiscal policy. So the combination of recognizing the problems with discretionary fiscal policy on the one hand, and the fact that central banks were able to take control of interest rates and implement monetary policy more effectively on the other, means that fiscal policy and the discretionary fiscal policy rather fell into disrepute, which was a good thing. And post the 1970s into the 1980s, the discretionary fiscal policy component of fiscal policy falls away, and governments aren't using it. And fiscal policy now relies on the so-called built-in stabilizers. If you like, it now relies on what are called automatic stabilizers, and we're going to discuss that in due course. The stance of fiscal policy, whether fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary in the context of the built-in stabilizers, is then shown by the size of the budget deficit. So if the budget deficit increases, it will be read as stimulatory fiscal policy, stimulatory automatic built-in stabilizers. If the budget deficit was declining, it will be read as contractionary built-in stabilizers. We now turn our attention to the understanding of the statement that was made in the previous slide about the automatic stabilizers or the built-in stabilizers. And the best way to understand them is to look first of all at the horizontal axis of this diagram, which shows the state of the economy. If you like, it shows GDP. On the horizontal part, on the left-hand part of the horizontal axis, we would have the economy in recession. On the right-hand part, we'd have the economy in boom. And on the vertical axis, we look at the government budget, starting with government expenditure. Now, the typical relationship that we have in the rich world is that when an economy goes into recession, there's automatic increases in government expenditure, and they increase because of unemployment benefits, of subsidies, of things of that nature as the economy goes into recession. And as the economy grows, so these automatic changes decline, there's less subsidies, there's less unemployment benefits and things of that nature. So graphically, what we would see is we would see an inverse relationship between government expenditure on the one hand and the state of the economy on the other. So as the economy goes into recession, government expenditure would automatically increase with the subsidies and unemployment benefits, and that is what happens to government expenditure. So as it goes into recession, government expenditure increases, and as the economy begins to grow, government expenditure decreases. That's, of course, in the rich world. In emerging markets, what you have happening is that you don't have this social safety net that we have in the rich world. And as the economy changes, there are very few changes in government expenditure. So you do tend to have a much flatter government expenditure line. And in some countries, it can be perfectly horizontal. To now begin to understand the difference between the automatic stabilizers and discretionary fiscal policy, we turn to the next diagram. So again, we have the same relationship that we established in the previous diagram. And an automatic stabilizer would be we start at G1 and Y1, and for some reason the economy goes into recession, or the economy begins to slow. And as a result of that, unemployment benefits increase, government expenditure increases, and it tends to stabilize the economy because of that automatic stimulatory effect of government expenditure. Those are your built-in stabilizers. This needs to be contrasted with a discretionary policy change. So if we start again at Y2, the increase from G1 to G2 is a built-in stabilizer. It's an automatic process. Unemployment increases as you move from Y1 to Y2. Unemployment benefits kick in and expenditure automatically goes from G1 to G2. If government now makes a policy change, then the entire curve will move. So that you can see the movement from G1 to G2 is the result of a discretionary change of the change in policy. And now government expenditure increases from G1 to G3, where the G2, G3 component of the expenditure is a discretionary policy change. So for example, you may have unemployment benefits increasing G1 to G2, and government may decide to do some other kinds of stimulatory policies. Simple one, build a road. So the building of the road is a discretionary policy change, and expenditure increases G2 to G3. So we have the two components of expenditure here. If we now look at this from the other side, and we look at it from a tax perspective, which is the other side of the government budget, we have on the horizontal axis the same horizontal axis. And you look at this now from a tax perspective, which is the tax revenues. If we have a flat tax, meaning that taxes are a fixed percentage of income, then clearly as the economy grows, so taxes will increase. And if we have what is called a progressive tax, which means that as income increases, so people move to higher and higher income brackets. For example, if your income is a certain amount, you may say pay 10% of your income as taxes. If your income increases, you may pay 15%, 20%, 30%, and so on. So you're moving into higher and higher tax brackets. And the consequence then is you would have a non-linear increase in taxes because of these increases in tax brackets. As we did before, let's make a distinction between the automatic and discretionary changes in taxes. So if we start off with the economy at Y1 and the tax collection is at T1, if the economy grows from Y1 to Y2, we're earning more, you pay more taxes, and the consequence is that there's an automatic increase in tax collection from T1 to T2. It's important to recognize that this is not a tax rate. The tax rate is unchanged. You're still paying a certain proportion of your income as taxes. Because you're earning more, the tax collection component has gone up. That is the built-in stabilizer. If we contrast this now to a discretionary change in taxes, then a discretionary change in taxes would be seen as a change in the tax line. So for example, we're at Y2 and now we increase the tax rate. So you're no longer paying 10% on your income, you're paying 20% on your income. And the consequence is now that the tax collection goes from T2 to 3T as a result of an increase in the tax rate. So the movement from T1 to T2, the tax rate's unchanged, you're earning more, you pay more taxes, there's more tax collection. The movement from T2 to T3 is a result of an increase in the tax rate. You were paying 10%, you now pay 20%, and of course the tax collection goes up more than proportionately. We are now in a position where we can talk about the automatic or the built-in stabilizers. So what we're doing in this slide here is we're now bringing together government expenditure plus taxes so that we now have the full government budget on the vertical axis in euro terms. And obviously we have the functions shown here on the right. And we need to now understand, and the purpose of this slide is to understand how the structure of the budget works as a built-in stabilizer and works as a stabilizer for the business cycles. A word of caution here is that I ideally need to be able to work between this slide and the next slide and move backwards between the slides. As you know now, the PowerPoint recordings doesn't let me do that. So I need to talk you through this particular slide, and then I talk you through the next slide. So obviously we need to just appreciate this is not as fluid as I'd like it to be. But let's use the slide and let's start off at a point Y1. So at a point Y1, as you can see, we have that level of income. At that level of income, government expenditure is shown by where the laser point is in the red line. Taxes is shown on the blue line. They're obviously equal. And if you look what's happening here in this table here, we've got the position in the diagram. We've got the kind of budget situation that we have. And we have the stance of fiscal policy, where the fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary or neutral. At Y1, we have a situation clearly in the diagram where government expenditure is equal to taxes. And when government expenditure is equal to taxes, I'm taking the same amount of money out of the economy, €1 million, as I'm putting back into the economy, €1 million. So in that instance, we would talk about the government budget as the stance of the government budget as being neutral. If we now move to the left of Y1, so we're now moving, the economy is slowing down, we're moving from Y1 to Y2, you can see the consequence of that on the expenditure side is that government expenditure goes up automatically. There's increases in unemployment, there's increases in unemployment benefits, so there's an automatic increase in government expenditure. Similarly, tax collections decline, incomes decline because of the slowing economy. Because incomes decline, tax collections decline, and we move from where we were originally down to point T2. If we look at this in the little table that we're developing here, here you have a budget deficit where expenditure exceeds taxes. And in the first instance, the budget is stimulatory. Now that's in the first instance. So if we do it at a simple level to start with, so now what I'm doing is I'm taxing, say, €1 million as taxes, and I'm spending like €2 million as government expenditure. That can be argued to be stimulatory. We'll come back and we'll look at some exceptions around that in a moment. Then the third situation that we can have is where income increases now from Y1 to Y2, so the economy starts to grow. From Y1 to Y3, so now the economy starts to grow. And the consequence, as you can see, is that unemployment declines, therefore benefits decline, therefore automatically government expenditure declines from this position here through to G3. And because the economy is growing and incomes are increasing, so tax collections increase automatically to T3. In this case here, T3 exceeds G3 and we have a government budget surplus. And again, in the first instance, that can be argued to be contractionary. In other words, I'm now taking €2 million out of an economy. I'm spending €1 million back into the economy, and that can be argued to be contractionary. We're going to use this conversation we're having here in the next slide to illustrate how the structure of the budget is it becomes a built-in stabilizer. But before we can't get to that slide just yet, but just have a look at the diagram. So what is happening is that when we move from Y1 to Y2, as the economy slows, the government budget automatically moves into a deficit, and that automatically is stimulatory. So it stimulates the economy as it slows. Similarly, as the economy begins to grow from Y1 to Y3, the government budget deficit automatically kicks into a surplus, so taxes now exceed government expenditure. And because that happens, it becomes contractionary. And therefore, as the economy goes into a boom phase, and maybe you have inflation and things of that nature, the government budget automatically begins to contract the economy and therefore stabilizes what's happening in the boom phase. Before we move to that and illustrate that, I want to just talk to the potential exceptions that you can have. So we said when we were here at the simple level that a government budget deficit can be stimulatory. Now there are clearly exceptions to that, and the first exception to that is where you borrow the money from in order to fund the government budget deficit. You need to refer to an earlier slide where we spoke about this in more detail. I'll give you one example of that. For example, if the government budget deficit is being funded by borrowing from the capital market, and it was the primary long bond market, And if you have a situation where that causes increased interest rates and it crowds out private investment, refer to the earlier slide, the crowding out of the private investment might actually prevent the stimulatory effect of the government budget deficit. So we're saying that the budget deficit is stimulatory because government expenditure exceeds taxes. But if this situation crowds out private investment, then any increase in government expenditure may, for example, be at the expense of a fall in private expenditure, and you may end up in a situation actually where it's not stimulatory. It may even be contractionary. The second exception that you can have with the tale we're telling here is if you have a situation where your public debt is simply too high. The Japanese case and most of Europe. And if the public believe that because the public debt is too high, that this is going to result in future tax increases, then the situation may occur, as it possibly does in Japan, that any stimulatory budget deficit, any cut in taxes, for example, instead of being used for the purposes of expenditure, are rather saved in anticipation of the possibility of future tax increases. So a budget deficit in that case would not be stimulatory. It could be neutral. It could even be contractionary, depending on the degree of the change. Similarly, we are making the point here that a budget surplus is contractionary, but that depends again on the situation. So there are exceptions. So if we take the first of the exceptions, it depends what you do with the money. It depends what you do with the surplus. It depends what government does with the surplus. If government uses the budget surplus to pay off debt inside the country, then a budget surplus, instead of being contractionary, actually can be neutral. So take a situation here. Here we are taxing, for example, at 2 million. We're spending back 1 million as government expenditure, so we have a surplus of 1 million. If we then use that 1 million to pay off debt inside the country, then your budget surplus has not been contractionary. In fact, it's been neutral, because effectively I've taken 2 million out of the economy, I spent 1 million back as government expenditure, and I've taken the remaining 1 million and repaid the debt, which simply goes back to people in a different form of expenditure. So the consequence that you have is that in fact your policy can be neutral if you repay your local debt. It's only contractionary if the surplus is sterilized. Now, I think that is the first time we've used the word in our conversations. So when we talk about sterilized, what we mean here is if the budget surplus is taken off the table. In other words, if it's not used. So when a surplus is sterilized, it's removed, it's put into what some countries would call a stabilization account. It's important, if I may, just that the stabilization account and the sterilization of this surplus is not the same as the reserves account in the balance of payments. The reserves account in the balance of payments is foreign exchange. In this case here, we're talking about domestic currency, not foreign exchange. So they're different. So if you are running a budget surplus and you want it to be contractionary and you are going to pay back debt to local people, to the local capital market, the local bond market, that can be neutral. The only way you can do that would be to sterilize the surplus. One of the problems that you would then have is that there's a potential policy conflict between the short-term contractionary policies and the need to sterilize on the one hand, and possibly the need for debt repayment. So if one takes the situation that we have in Europe as we speak, Europe is awash with debt and government debt. And what governments really want to do is they want to pay off the debt. But should we ever get to a situation where European governments begin to run a budget surplus, and there are some countries where we're seeing budget surpluses coming through, then clearly what the governments want to do is they want to pay off their debt. Yet, if they are in a situation where they want that budget surplus to be contractionary, so they want this system to work as a built-in stabilizer, then they have to sterilize the surplus, and that clearly becomes a policy conflict. So this brings us on to the next slide, which is the one that I wanted to be able to work together with the previous slide, but we can cope with this. So what we have in the slide here, this is a business cycle without any automatic stabilizers. And what you can have happening is you can have, if we have the situation before, if you're in recession, so if you're sitting here in recession, and now the automatic stabilizers kick in, so what will occur then, as you go into recession, government expenditure will increase automatically, tax collections will decline automatically, and there's an automatic stimulation that's happening at that point in the recession. Similarly, as the economy begins to grow and goes into a boom phase, what will happen then is you'll get automatic contraction in government expenditure on the one hand, you'll get automatic increases in tax revenues on the other, and that process results in a business cycle which is stabilized. So the red line is then showing you what the business cycle looks like in the face of having these stabilizers. So you don't have the wild increase up to a boom. You have a much smaller increase, and you don't drop down as severely as would be the case into a recession. You have a cushioned recession in that particular case. So we're now going to take what we've done in theory and apply this to the real world. So what we have in this diagram, as you can see, we have the stabilizers, we understand how they work, and in order to begin to apply this to the real world, we have to address a particular question. What's wrong with the diagram? Well, what's wrong with the diagram is that certainly before the financial crisis, most countries were running budget deficits at full capacity. So in other words, you have economies which could go up to the point of full capacity. They couldn't, in the short term, they couldn't achieve a level of Y1 in order to run a balanced budget, and they certainly couldn't achieve growth rates which could put them to the right of Y1 and actually achieve budget surpluses. So what was happening in the real world prior to the financial crisis is that many, if not most, governments in the world were running budget deficits at a point of full capacity. So where the laser pointer is, that's on your production possibility frontier. It's at your vertical portion of the long run aggregate supply curve, meaning in the short term, you cannot move to the right of that point of full capacity. And what happened and the way this developed, this is a historical development. So what you've got here in terms of the structure of the government budget, these are political decisions. So from a political point of view, this is how governments decided that they would increase benefits, if you like, they would keep taxes down, and these are political decisions because these are policy decisions where these lines actually sit. So the policy decisions prior to the onset of the financial crisis resulted in a situation that many countries around the world, and particularly many countries in Europe, were running deficits at full capacity. What we're looking at in this diagram here, this is the UK, and I want to use the UK as an example to illustrate the workings of the built-in stabilizers and to move towards how fiscal policy changed in the context of the financial crisis. So this is the UK government budget deficit as a percentage of GDP from 1995 to the onset of the financial crisis, just before the onset of the financial crisis. This was a period of significant economic growth in the UK and in the world. And if you look at the government budget deficit in the UK, apart from a small surplus over here, the UK runs a government budget deficit across the entire period, and across the entire period where there's good economic growth. So if you can refer back to the previous slide, what you have is you have a budget deficit at a point where the UK economy is at full employment. Which brings us on then to moving from the UK as an isolated example to a much bigger selection of rich world countries in this particular slide, And what you're looking at in this slide is, as you can see, the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP in 2007, which is the year before the onset of the financial crisis. And you can see in this diagram that with 3 exceptions, all of this selection of countries was running budget deficits in the face of good economic times on the one hand, and they were running budget deficits in excess of 3% of GDP. And this is 3% of GDP, not 0.3% of GDP. So what one takes away from this is that there were political decisions being made in the selection of countries such that we had a situation that the government budget resulted in budget deficits even where there was strong economic growth. The selection of countries in the deficit in this diagram here, they were running structural budget deficits, permanent budget deficits. The only 2 exceptions we've got in this diagram, as you can see, is Canada and Sweden, and they were running fiscal surpluses. And Spain, which is an apparent exception, and it's apparent because the bulk of the Spanish revenue at this particular time in this particular slide was as a result of taxes on property transactions. And that, of course, was the big property boom that was happening in Spain. The subsequent collapse of the property boom in Spain means that the Spanish surplus was a very temporary thing, and it goes into a deficit very rapidly after that. Which then brings us on to changes in fiscal policy in a very short period of time between the onset of the financial crisis and somewhere around about 2009 to 2010, depending on the country. So what we have in those periods there is you have, as you know, the financial crisis. We also have monetary policy impotence. Interest rates are 0. We don't yet have QE coming in quite so early on, and it's certainly not being used extensively. And as a result, the only policy option available to governments was discretionary fiscal policy. So the kinds of fiscal policies that had fallen out of favor in the 1970s and particularly from the 1980s onwards, which is the discrete changes in fiscal policy in order to address changes in the economy, now come back into vogue, and correctly so. What you've got here in the financial crisis is a major economic shock, and a major economic shock, particularly in the face of monetary policy impotence. That major economic shock needs major actions, and discretionary fiscal policy is the right thing to do. So what we're going to do is we're now going to trace these changes that we see here, and then the changes subsequent to that from 2010 onwards in the context of the UK economy. So what we have in this slide, as you can see, is that we're still using the stabilizers, but I've now added a time dimension into the slide. So we have, in the UK, we have taxes in 2007, we have expenditure in 2007, and that is a time dimension, that's GDP in 2007. And what we have, as we saw from the previous slide, we have a budget deficit at full capacity in 2007. So now the UK enters the financial crisis, and the consequence of going into the financial crisis clearly is that income falls. So GDP falls from the point at Y 2007 to Y 2009, so the UK enters that recession. And the budget deficit opens automatically from the value of A to B to the point C to D. It was at this, and that is stimulatory. But the policy decision taken in the UK is that this was insufficient, and therefore, and to repeat it, correctly so, the UK invoked discretionary fiscal policy. Now, so the UK went and made discrete stimulatory changes to expenditure and taxes. So in the UK, you have a discrete change in expenditure. So now the blue line moves to the red line, which is now a policy decision rather than automatic stabilizer, and taxes are cut. The consequence of doing that, of course, is that the budget deficit had been the distance CD. It now opens up and it becomes the distance EF. So although we have discretionary fiscal policy, the consequence is that the budget deficit increased by more. And if we just look at the numbers associated with that, you can see how the budget deficit increases. So you can see here's that increase in the budget deficit we had from point A to there's point AB, there's CD, there's your EF. And you can see that at point EF, we have a budget deficit in the UK of approaching 11% of GDP. That eventually became too big, and it became too big for the British public to be able to live with, and it became too big for the bond markets to be able to live with. And there was the ongoing threat at that stage that the bond markets would punish the UK as they punished Greece eventually, and Portugal and Spain and Italy, by increasing the cost of UK debt. So the consequence then is that what happened shortly after that, just to repeat, we have monetary policy impotence in 2010. We then have the European debt crisis. And in the face of the European debt crisis, where the bond market is punishing Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, etc., governments then invoke fiscal austerity. So even though we have major recessions, the size of the budget deficits and the size of the debt results in increases in fiscal austerity. The main reason that we had fiscal austerity is that because European debt levels had been so high going into the crisis, that European governments had no room to maneuver. If the European governments had gone into the financial crisis with budget surpluses, then the fiscal stimulation that we saw in the previous slide and happening in the UK, that would have worked. It would have worked because there would have been a surplus. There would have been sufficient money maybe in a stabilization account, which had been sterilized from previous surpluses, and the British government and European governments would have had room to maneuver. The fact that political decisions had been made in the decade or so or more before that occurred, and we had structural deficits, we had permanent deficits, there was no room to maneuver. So in the face then of the financial crisis, European governments really had no choice, both from a political pressure point of view in the UK's case, and political pressure on Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain from other countries in Europe, to increase taxes and actually go and go for austerity, where austerity means reduce the government budget. This, of course, leads to fiscal impotence. Let's have a look. So now we go back to the UK. Okay, so we're sitting in 2009 in this time, but in reality in 2010 with a budget deficit of EF, and the British public responding to their own internal concerns about the size of the deficit and growing political pressure from Europe generally and pressure from the bond market, go for a change of government, and the new government, the new Conservative government, invoke austerity. Austerity means increasing taxes and cutting expenditure. And the consequence of doing that is that your budget deficit then shrinks from point EF to point GH. But that's contractionary. So the effect of that being contractionary is that incomes in the UK shrink further. And as they shrink, so of course the budget deficit opens up again automatically to the point IJ. Oh dear. And then Britain was lucky. And for some inexplicable reason, for some reason that we can't explain, even in the face of this growing austerity, Britain began to grow. So GDP did begin to increase from 2010 onwards and has continued to grow. And in the process of doing that, the budget deficit has shrunk and has shrunk and has shrunk. And in my opinion, that was luck. It wasn't by design, it was purely good fortune. Finally, we get a complete overview of what's happened with the UK budget deficit over the period we've been discussing. So you can see in this earlier period here how we have a budget deficit around about 3% of GDP. Then we have that very large increase in the budget deficit up to 2010. And since that time, and without repeating what's been said in the previous discussions, the budget deficit has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And finally, in this particular diagram, as you can see here, 2018, is that we now have a budget deficit under the critical 3% mark. And of course, it's now sitting at 2%. At the same time, and one of the things which has helped the UK economy to reduce the budget deficit has been the fact that there has been economic growth. Okay, it's not been fantastic economic growth, but it's been economic growth, and that helps the process. The other thing that helps the process, of course, is that there's been ongoing austerity in the UK to bring the budget deficit into line, and it clearly has been successful. If we do the same thing from a Greek perspective, if we start with the budget deficit, you can see here how we have this very, very large budget deficit at the height of the financial crisis, how it dips down again in 2013, that very large budget deficit, and how in recent years there's been a rapid turnaround in the budget deficit from a budget deficit, as you can see, to a budget surplus. Part of the success of doing that in recent years, again, as you can see from the top diagram, is that there has been economic growth in Greece. And so the combination of the growth itself has helped to turn the deficit into a surplus. And of course, the incredible austerity that was imposed on Greece has also helped to turn that budget deficit into a budget surplus. We've had long discussions in lectures about the desirability of what happened in Greece and the desirability of the Greek austerity. There's different opinions on the matter. On the one hand, it needed to happen, that the deficit was simply too large and unsustainable, and there were transfers between certain countries in Europe and Greece, and they were unsustainable and they were politically unsustainable. On the other hand, the austerity that was imposed on Greece had vast humanitarian consequences. So that's it. That's as far as I'm going to take that conversation. I think from a factual point of view, the Greek deficit has rapidly in the last few years turned into a surplus, and simultaneously there has been economic growth that's been occurring alongside that. If we look at Italy, now this is an interesting one. Italy, you see these very large budget deficits here in the period around the financial crisis, and you can see how those deficits have declined over time. You can see also that the deficit is fairly constant in 2010, 11, 12, and that coincides with that second of the recessions that we have in Italy. There's been some economic growth in Italy, as you can see here, which clearly helps with the deficit being reduced. The other part, of course, of the thing that drove the Italian budget deficit to decrease was imposed austerity on Italy, much as we saw with imposed austerity on Greece. It wasn't as severe. The budget deficit wasn't as severe. But what is really interesting now, if you look just at the end of the diagram, Greece, as we speak in this diagram, is going into recession. Oh dear, oh dear. The final one that I want to show you is what happened in Spain. The budget deficit over the course of the financial crisis. Again, as we know, but I mean really, really significant deficit, which of course coincides with this recession that you're seeing in Spain over here.
Austerity is then imposed on Spain, and the budget deficit begins to shrink. At the same time, and there are many reasons for this, but one of the reasons is pure good fortune, that even in the face of the austerity and even in the face of a reducing budget deficit, the Spanish economy began to grow for various reasons which are beyond this conversation. And the consequence of that is that the budget deficit has been shrinking and is almost at this point that we're looking at in the latest data we've got here, is the budget deficit is within a whisker of being under the 3% mark. So Spain has been lucky. Spain also did many good things in order to get the economy to grow and to reduce the budget deficit. And then finally, we come to a diagram that you've seen before. What we're looking at here is we're looking at government debt. So this is not the budget deficit. This is government debt. It's the accumulation of the deficit in 2007, shown as the blue line, 2012 shown as the red line, and the most recent data shown as the green line. The 60% debt limit is shown in the diagram, and the reason for having the 3 years in here is to show you the trend of which way is debt going. Is it getting bigger and smaller? In terms of the debt limit, there's only one country in the selection of countries that we're looking at here which has got a government debt which is less than the limit, and of course that's Sweden. Every other country in this table has got debt which is greater than the international limit. Japan is a world leader, Greece is a runner-up, and then Italy takes third place. Clearly, these are not things to be proud of. These are things to be concerned about. Yet, if you look at some other countries, the US, the UK, we look at Spain, we look at France, we look at Germany, all of these countries have got government debt which is beyond what we should expect. And then if you look at the trend, which clearly is also worrying, the US has government debt which continues to increase, as does the UK, as does Spain, as does Italy, Hungary, Greece. German debt is declining, the French debt continues to increase, the debt in Belgium continues to increase. And I think the point that was made earlier in the course, and the point that is going to be made again in this context, and as I said, this is your destiny. If you live and work in the rich world, apart from Sweden, is swamped with debt. Sooner or later, this debt has to be unwound. Unwinding debt is a difficult and painful process. There needs to be some form of austerity, albeit relatively mild, but austerity will hold back economic growth and will limit the growth potential of the countries you're seeing in this diagram. So, as I said before, if you want opportunity and you have nerves of steel, come to Africa. And that brings us not only to the end of the section, but to the end of the course. I really hope you've learned something. I really hope this course has been useful. So what do you take away? Well, hopefully you take away a vast increase in your knowledge about economics and the world. I hope you take away the understanding of how do you forecast business cycles and how do you look ahead. I hope you take away some knowledge about what drives interest rates and how you forecast interest rates. I hope also you understand what debt means, what budget deficits mean, what the balance of payments means, what exchange rates mean, and what real exchange rates mean. And I hope you had some fun, because economics can be dreadfully boring, or it can be a little bit more lively. And I hope that I've managed to deliver something that I try and achieve, and that's just to make it a little bit more lively. All the best. Cheers.